Hello, everybody. Welcome to Popular Music Book and Process series, a joint project of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music US chapter, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. I'm Elena Razlogova, one of the series organizers, along with Kimberly Mack, Eric Weisbart, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, and Alex Veazey. You can find our entire calendar on our IASPA website under the Journal tab. You can also catch up on videos of all our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including a session on Black music and online discourses from 2 weeks ago with Gustavo Souza Marquez and Mike Levine. Today's session presents Will Kaufman and PMBiP organizer Gus Stadler discussing Will's forthcoming book, American Song and Struggle from World War II to MAGA, which is coming out from Cambridge University Press in October. And and they will also be talking about protest music and the shifting historical relationship of music and politics. Let me give you some quick background on today's presenters. Will Kaufman is the author of American Song and Struggle from Columbus to World War II, which came out in 2022, which won the 2023 Choice 360 Award for the best academic title in music. He was born in New York City and raised in Montclair, New Jersey, earning a BA in English and History from Montclair State College and a PhD in American Literature from University of Wales, Aberystwyth, in 1985. After 33 years teaching English and American Studies at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, England, he retired as Emeritus Professor of American Cultural History. Kaufman is recognized internationally as the world's leading authority on Woody Guthrie, having written 3 books on the American balladeer. And I'm not going to give you all the titles, but please read them. His other works include Singing for Peace, Antiwar Songs in American History, co-authored with Ronald Cohen, and American Culture in the 70s and the Civil War in American Culture. Gus Stadler is the author of Woody Guthrie: An Intimate Life, and Troubling Minds, The Cultural Politics of Genius in the US, 1840 to 1890. He has published essays on music and sound culture in Al Jazeera, public books, social text, and other venues. He's William R. Kennan Professor of English at Haverford College and co-edits the music section at publicbooks.com with Gail Wald. He's currently working on the cultural biography of music producer Tom Wilson Jr., tentatively titled Tom Wilson's America. During the conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. In the last part of the session, Carl will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversations, so you can comment at any time. However, we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat during their discussion. We'll send them a copy of the chat transcript later, so they won't miss anything. And now I'm going to turn things over to our presenters.
Okay, is it me, Gus?
First?
Yeah. Okay.
Take it away.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for taking the effort to consider the book, and maybe if you've had a chance to peruse I strictly emphasize uncorrected proofs, or the audios, which also need a little bit of probably punching in. I'm grateful that you took the time to have me and to go through the work. I sort of wanted to put this work in the frame of what the overall American Song and Struggle project was or is. And the way that it started is that, as Ellen said, I've kind of made my name mostly as a Woody Guthrie scholar. And I guess it was about the time of the Guthrie centenary in 2012 that I became increasingly aware of Woody Guthrie as, well, people referring to him as, the father of the American protest song, or even the first singer-songwriter, things like that, which certainly Woody himself, I believe, would have surely denied that. He would have denied that he did not have an extensive inherited song tradition, to build upon. And Yet, I think when we think of protest music, which is problematic, and I'll get into why I choose, even though that phrase keeps coming back to bite me in the butt. And I even, sort of fall into the habit of using it myself. But why I want something broader than protest music as a topic of interest for me. Um, like now, if you were to do a quick Google search or a book search using the retrieval word American protest music, first of all, you'd bring up a top-heavy selection of titles that are probably lodged in the 20th century, maybe some into the 21st century at this point. Certainly, the latter half of the period that I call AG. This is after Guthrie, and there are some books that do have chapters maybe devoted to someone like Joe Hill or the Hutchinson family singers or people that predated Woody Guthrie, or the Wobblies or spirituals or abolitionist songs. And I think other books may offer the more comprehensive histories of particular musical genres. You could probably get a history of rap or gospel or soul or even American folk music. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find something more comprehensive, something that spans musical genres as well as the many centuries in that era. BG, before Guthrie. You got BG and AG. So that's how it started for me. I actually had a working title for the first volume as Before Woody Guthrie. But then various people impressed upon me that maybe we need to leave decenter Woody and go for something a bit more expansive and broader. And that also included expanding the concept of what you would call protest music, which can be a little bit of a confining box. It can be a little bit reductive, I think, because I think there's more to the issue than I won't say mere protest, but simply protest. Um, Now, how to define even a protest song? Probably you're going to get a lot of people coming up with different attempts and different definitions of it. I think it's likely that a protest song, if you wanted to call it that, are likely to have an identifiable target or an object of protest. And that's why Bob Dylan calls them finger pointing songs, you know. I think protest was too narrow a concept for him. And that's, I don't mean in terms of his withdrawal into more personal, artistic, philosophical realms. I just think that if he had things to say about social issues, I think he was uncomfortable utilizing the phrase protest song. Um, so I think Woody also had that problem, Woody Guthrie, and I think that's why he proposed an idea to his producer at Folkways, Moses Ash, an album of songs not about protest, but rather about something broader, larger, and that's struggle. And in fact, one of his posthumous albums produced by Folkways and released in 1976 was called Struggle, right? Now, I think arguably all protest songs are songs of struggle, at least implicitly, but the reverse is not necessarily the case. I think a song of struggle may be more philosophical. I guess it may be directed inwardly about a personal struggle that you have and an engagement with some problem or another that you may have. It's a song of struggle that is probably worthy of note. There's struggle in terms of the act of singing. Um, as I've said, how to sing, where to sing, whether you're even allowed to sing at all, whether you're able to sing. So I think a protest song sort of shuts the box down a bit. So struggle opens up the discussion for me. Um, And if you're interested in history, which I am, very much, sometimes I'm not quite sure that my interest in history um, overpowers my interest in the music itself. I think I probably have to put up my hand, and even as a musician, I'll say that, you know. But I'm aware that if I look at something other than protest, then I'm able to go back a lot further, BG, and see how people on the American continent really have always been singing of their struggles and have often struggled to sing. Um, and I don't think a comprehensive history of American song and struggle before 1940, which is when Woody shows up, when he arrives on the national scene, and when you're beginning to look at protest music as a brand, as an identifiable brand. Um, you could there weren't that many books. I don't think there were any really that I came across that comprehensively filled that gap. Um, so in trying to go back to even before recorded sound, as far back as I could go, obviously one of the first things I had to deal with was silence. How do you write about music and song when silence is a really, really strong inhibitor? Um, Well, so in the first volume, so many of my earliest sources were fragments. They were mentioned somewhere in an old journal, a little snip of song lyrics or a description of a song. We know that there were songs that were once upon a time sung, but now that all remains of them, are the words, not the music. And if I'm able and if you as readers are able to accept that we can talk about song without necessarily having access to the music, then we can go all the way back. And so in the first volume, I went all the way back to the Mexica songs, the cantares mexicanos, the Aztec laments that were left in the immediate wake of the Spanish conquest in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. I'm also able to see that that conquest actually began with music when Columbus and the conquistadors landed on the shores of Guanahani, and they sang the Salve Regina as a rite of taking possession to lands that were not theirs. That Salve Regina, Mater Misericordia Vita Dolcedo. Now, how that sounded to indigenous ears, we don't know. We'll never know, and that's a gap we have to live with. But we do know that for the Aztecs, the end game of the conquest was recorded in their Cantares Mexicanos. I've got a translation of one just briefly that I used in the first volume at when they're reflecting on in the wake of the Spanish conquest. Broken spears lie in the roads. We've torn our hair out in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. Worms are swarming in the streets and the plazas, and the walls are spattered with gore. The water has turned red as if it were dyed, and when we drink it, it has the taste of brine. Okay, that's a translation. So that's a very serious filter it's going through. B, there isn't music. So it's lyrics, if you want to call it that. Um, how was it sung in the original Nahuatl? How did it sound? We don't know and we can't know. But for me, I think that is the beginning of the tradition or the history that ultimately Woody Guthrie inherited. So when I wrote that book, I began the research during, um, I guess it was 2000 for that first book. God, I can't even remember. But one thing happened by the time I was writing it, and that is that Donald Trump was elected. It's one thing. and we had the COVID vaccine. That's the second thing. So a second volume came to me as being really an imperative because of the obvious mission of MAGA to erase history or to rewrite history and to eliminate, well, all knowledge of many of the struggles that have given birth to these songs. So that really was the imperative for the second volume. With the erasure of Black history, with the erasure of women's history, of queer history, of marginalized history, someone's got to, pick up the the pen and the baton, and I think that seemed to me to be a logical progression into a second volume. Have I like gone on and on and on? And how am I for time, you guys? Because I can just blah 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 blah, forever. Okay. So you may have seen the preface to the second volume, and I just want to read a little bit about that, just to remind you that in addition to my desire to make it comprehensive musically in terms of genre, because it's music, it's song, as far as I'm concerned. Um, I believe this project takes on a renewed urgency because now, in the midst of Donald Trump's second term under the banner of MAGA, books, exhibits, and performances are being banned throughout the USA in a perverse effort to erase anything that smacks of wokeness and whatever else MAGA zealots, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly Christian nationalist, find offensive. And, in the previous volume, I had made reference to Trump's 1776 commission, which attempted to set out a national curriculum devoid of wokeness and the ideological poison that people like Howard Zinn and other historians of marginalized, oppressed groups um, have delivered to us. So that also was a really important frame for the second volume that perhaps wasn't for the first volume. So you may find a little bit of a somewhat different voice or sense of urgency in the between the first and the second volumes, I think. Um, I think I'll turn it over to to Gus now because I don't know what to say. So over to you, buddy.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. No, that was great. And I think you sort of planted the seeds of a few of the things I'd like to ask you about. And I just want to say, I think this is an amazing project. It's really vital, and I don't know anybody else who's taken on this breadth of history or done it, obviously done it with the kind of nuance that you bring to these issues around what is protest and what is struggle. And I really love how, first of all, I just want to say also it's an extremely readable book. I want to say that to everybody here. Like it's a really it's a real page turner. But I think yeah, overall the thing that I think is most striking is how well you sort of um you almost sort of deconstruct the opposition between music and history. I mean, they're so intertwined. They're so intertwined in the book, and I guess this kind of leads into my first question, which is in a weird way to kind of like reconstruct that opposition. But I'm also just I'm really wowed by the breadth of this project, and it's just really hard for me to, as a writer, to imagine taking on something so so historically, where the reach is so long. And so I was just really curious about the act of writing these books and what composition was like. And I guess the first kind of question, that more specific question that comes to me in that vein is, you know, were you thinking, did you sit down and write down like a series of historical events and then like sort of fill in the music, or did you think of like a bunch of music, a bunch of music that you wanted to talk about, and then you filled in the history, or was it somehow some kind of combination of those two?
Yeah, I think it was a combination. First of all, I would say that my favorite kind of history is narrative history. I think the best histories really for me are, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then that happened, And so in that respect, it's not difficult to write something chronologically, even if it's going all the way back to 1492, you find out what came first and what came next and what came next, and you research that era, you find out what are important events, and then you begin to research how song responded to these events. So yeah, it was a chain, the chain of history. In terms of how you do it, you know, uh, I remember Kurt Vonnegut um, was answering a question of some writer or some aspiring student, creative writing student, who was amazed at how you could write a novel, and he said, it's a lot like blowing up a blimp with a bicycle tire, right? It doesn't take genius; all it takes is time. And COVID gave me that for the first volume. That's for damn sure.
Mm.
And retirement gave me that for the second volume. So, between the two of them, I had the time. I had the timeline that I researched with each of these things. The fact of time's arrow helped me a lot because it goes in one direction. Occasionally, I had to loop back a little bit. Like, for instance, I think in one of the chapters in the current book, I take it up to the end of 1964, and then I sort of loop back to 1963 and the Kennedy assassination because I couldn't fit that in. The narrative was forcing me to take it to the end of 1964. Then I figured, well, okay, I'll take it back. No one's going to shoot me. So if you look at the table of contents, you will see that sometimes there's some overlap and a little bit of regression to the starting point of that chapter. But I think overall, it's a pretty straightforward thing from 1940 to, well, today, you know. And that's how I did it, really. I don't know if that answered the
Oh,
question.
absolutely, yeah. I
Okay.
mean, I I think that leads into my next question as well, which I think you sort of you definitely touched on in your introduction, but um, and this has to do, I think, with the difference between the two volumes, which where we have in between those two volumes, we have a Trump elected for a second term, and I did notice in the forthcoming volume that there's this kind of clear, unabashed urgency around the moment that we're in right now. It pokes its head up like repeatedly, explicitly. You'll refer to today, to MAGA, or to
Mm.
um, the various horrible things that are happening now. And I thought this was really striking, in particular within a kind of project that, I mean, in some ways, I can see these books being on the reference shelf, like kind of like things, books that stay there for a long time that people consult for their sort of encyclopedic value. Um, and it seemed like an interesting tension with the sort of timelessness of that type of writing,
Mm.
between that and this very, very open grounding um, in this is the moment I'm writing from. This is why I need to get this book out. This is why I need you to hear this now. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that tension, or even, or even just maybe more about what it feels like to write in a moment where everything is just constantly changing, constantly, it's so erratic, so hard to
Yeah.
grasp.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing. I'll get into the constant changing. Um, in terms of the urgency, see, on the one hand, I wanted to write a comprehensive history, that, if I could, flatter myself, a book for the ages, one that will be looked at, for a long time, to look at these, however many centuries, 5 centuries of American song and struggle. But, the renewed urgency, I believe, came now. So that really lit a fire under my butt, to get this out as soon as possible. And really, I think I say in the preface that I took my cues on that from Heather Cox Richardson, who I am so grateful for her daily letters from an American, and and what because she knows she's writing in a period of serious attempts to erase all of that knowledge, even daily knowledge, yesterday's news, whatever, let's erase it. It didn't happen, right? Um, so she has that desperation, but then, so that's for the moment. But she also says, I'm writing, I want to leave, these are notes for a graduate student, an envisioned graduate student 150 years from now. And I took that cue and said, well, I think that's what I want to do, because who knows where we're going to be next year or in 2 years. But you think of some of the songs, you think of some of the memoirs, think of some of the memoirs that came out of Nazi Germany. The rise, particularly the rise of Nazi Germany. We're so lucky to have them. You know, spades of book burning. We're so lucky to have the slave narratives. Even the ones that are suspect in terms of their uh, execution at the hands of amanuenses or white abolitionists or whatever. We are so lucky to have all of these narratives, and so I felt, yeah, I want to write for today about the urgency of today, but I want people 150 years ago, 150 years from now, I want them to know how urgent we feel it is right now. I want them to feel. I want them to know what the terror of living today right now is like. And I hope I'm able to translate that. In terms of time and changing times, um, that's an issue that I think is relevant. And part of that also is the reason why I wanted to do an audiobook. Because, see, the way that most publishers work, or at least certainly Cambridge University Press, do it this way is that a guillotine comes down with what you could talk about. You've submitted your manuscript, it goes into the copy editing stage, and things happen. Now, for instance, this is before the typesetting stage. This is still the copy editing stage, when I would have thought this is where you have your last chance at updating or something like that. Well, they were very generous and let me include, when it came out, they let me include in the final chapter, I think it's even the conclusion, Springsteen's Streets of Minneapolis. I was able to get that in there, right? But they were like, now don't ask us again, because as they said, news happens. We're putting out 1,500 books a year. We can't stop the process because something shows up in the news, right? And I thought that was interesting, because when I talk about John Adams's the composer John Adams, his opera Nixon in China, I think he creates a character in Nixon who is unable to distinguish between historical significance and mere newsworthiness, right? So when I have someone telling me, "Look, news happens. Sorry, we can't update it. Don't ask again," I think, well, look at what they just found out about Cesar Chavez. Now I've got Cesar Chavez running as an icon through more than one chapter.
Yeah.
Am I not allowed to add a sentence just to indicate that, hey, this is what we have found out? This is going to complicate the Cesar. They said, nope, don't ask. So the only choice that I have now is, since I have complete control of the audiobook, and I say this in the note to the audiobook, it's my words, my copyright, I can consider the audiobook an updated version of the print volume. Even before the damn print volume is out there, I have to update it. So people listening to the audiobook will have access to information and material that I was not allowed to include in the print volume. And I'm very sad about that, because I think the print volume, with a little bit of more give from the publishers, the print volume could have been more up to date without any problem. This is the copy editing stage. It's not typesetting stage. I don't know what the problem was, but I had to go along with their restrictions.
Right.
So I don't know. That's the issue of time
Yeah.
for you there.
And that's such an interesting example too. I did think of that as I was reading when you started to talk about Chavez Ravine, and
Oh, yeah.
um, and it was clear like this must have been written without before the
Yeah,
yeah,
it was. And other songs, Jesse Wells's song about Iran. Sometimes you
yeah,
get out your B-2s and go bomb Iran, which he issued, weeks before
right,
the Iran war started. So, as I suggest in the audiobook, I give him his due there, and I quote from the song. That's another thing people may realize, that I've only quoted from, unless the song is either out of copyright, like Tom Lehrer, for instance, has put all his songs, copyright free. So I was able to quote freely from him.
right,
Tom Paxton and Kathy Fink gave me explicit permission to quote extensively from their songs, about the Epstein files, and No Kings Here. And I Bought Me a President. I'm able to quote extensively, but otherwise, I can only quote maybe, whatever it is within fair use, and there's a very hazy area, but maybe two lines from a song, so as not to get sued or have to ask for permission either,
right, right.
you know. Because I don't know if anyone else writing about music has dealt with this, but I did see some guidelines from, I think it was Oxford University Press, and they said, look, if you don't have to ask for permission, then don't. Because if you ask for permission, even when you don't have to, they are going to hit you with, hundreds of dollars worth of quotation fees. So that's my little advice to anybody out there who's going to get into this business. Try to write within fair use, and that's what I really worked on. And so that's another reason why, consequently, you go to the first volume, and you'll see a difference. When you get to around the 1930s and the 40s, all of a sudden the references to the song become, shorter and shorter, because the stuff out of copyright, I picked up and ran with it. But
Yeah,
you can't do that when you're writing about popular music, or any kind of music for that matter. You know, so that was a big struggle, too.
yeah,
You know, so
yeah. Those issues really make me miss being a 19th century scholar.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah,
um,
or 16th centuries even
yeah.
better. Yeah.
I wanted to also just quickly illuminate something that came out in your last comment, which is I just want people to know that the range of music that you're talking about in these books is so wide. So you mentioned John Adams, and opera is a recurring presence in the book. Avant-garde music, John Cage, Milton Babbitt, all kinds of just again, all kinds of genres are coming up here that we don't ordinarily they aren't the fierce kinds of music that we think of when we think about politics and music. So um, I just want to make sure that that's clear to people. Um,
Yeah.
changing changing direction a little bit. Well, there were a couple of things that as I was reading that came to me that I started to wonder what you would say about that you don't really get into, but that I'd love to just hear your thoughts about. And um, I'm going to tell you both of them at once and try to be as succinct as possible, but we'll see how it goes. One is the sort of the history of like the wider media landscape
Mhm.
around music, because there's so many different ways that music reaches people's ears,
Yeah.
and they've changed so much over the many centuries, and they've changed quite rapidly, in the last 150 years since the phonograph and then there are different formats of phonography, and then we have, you know, TV and MP3s and all of these things. Um, and I'm just interested in how you think those kinds of that history, if you have any thoughts about how that history plays a
Yeah.
role in history you're
Yeah,
narrating.
yeah. And I did touch on it a little bit. For instance, I would touch on the invention of the tape recorder or the phonograph or the LP, the long play record and things like that. Then I think, for instance, I could have written a whole book on streaming and what all that does, and things like Spotify. I think that the the best that I could do, because I wanted to get some reference in there to what Spotify does, and it's a very quick reference. You almost miss it, but it's from David Rovix, the protest singer-songwriter, who I have many times said is certainly one of the main heirs to Woody Guthrie. Certainly, I think I refer to him in the book as one of the hardest working protest singers since Woody Guthrie, because he's out there writing stuff daily
Mm.
and getting hammered by the authorities for doing this. Go give a listen to David Rovix. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Rovics. He really, really is someone to listen to, who's effectively on the barricades every day, right? And he writes about, I think he's writing about COVID and what COVID is going to do around the year 2020, 2021. And he says, look, we've already been whacked by, the free Spotify streaming services. So streaming does, in a sense, make you know, access to music more democratic from the listener's side, but it may also impoverish the artists from the production side. So I've talked a little bit about that. How do we listen? I think the way in which we listen, whether it's phonographs or radio or TV or YouTube or whatever, they determine, I think, to some extent, what the listening community is going to consist of, how it's going to be constituted, you know. And that's a big issue because, and I think we had that discussion in email about, it seems that listening to music is in danger of becoming a more and more individualized experience. You're sitting there with your headphones on, and you're jogging or whatever it is you're doing. You know, what about the community of a listening community and producing community, for that matter? I think. And it struck me that that's a really serious question, because when you think of, for instance, the civil rights music, how important group singing was to you know to the church, excuse me, the importance that the Highlander folk school put on community singing, and how the church gave the church was the community, right? So the community singing, giving people a sense of their own power, a sense of their own voice, and a sense of the massive solidarity. It's not just one person singing on a street corner, like Woody Guthrie. This is, a whole group of people singing. I think it's interesting that I think in the conclusion I touch on the seems to be a gathering again of community singing in terms of the No Kings movement.
Mhm.
You're beginning to find pockets of communities that are getting out there and singing. In terms of the community that's being drawn together from, say, Bruce Springsteen's latest tour, which is obviously a challenge to the Trump administration. I mean, it's a trolling of the Trump administration for sure. You know, what kind of community that is? Is it really a politically engaged community, or is it a Bruce community? I don't know. But it just seems to me that in moments of political crisis, communities do form that are based around song.
Mm.
Um, and I think we should, be glad about that. There are also online musical communities. I think I talk about the things like Rock the Vote, Rock Against Reagan, Rock Against Bush, um, the Thousand Songs, or the Dave Eggers anti-Trump, songs for Trump-free America, uh, whatever it was, 100 songs, 100 days that expanded into 1,000 songs, 1,000 days, whatever the number of that was. So online communities like all of us here right now, you know, that's a very strong possibility. Janice Ian's Better Times project, where in the midst of COVID, she was able to get a whole international community, together to boost each other's uh, well, what would you call it? Boost each other's strength, boost each other's,
Right.
tackle everyone's loneliness
Yeah.
in during lockdown, during isolation, and they can all submit their versions of Her Better Times Will Come. Things like that, I think, are a good indication of the medium possibilities. So sorry, I didn't even take a breath when I was doing that. Sorry.
No, that's great. Actually, yeah, you really went into
Everywhere.
what the next thing I was going to bring up was community, which, obviously,
Right.
um, I think does follow naturally from that question of media, because media, construct audiences quite differently, different media. So,
Sure.
um, yeah, I think just another thing that was really striking to me as I was reading was well, first of all, since you're telling, this is especially in the parts that are based in the history of the U.S. The books really remind us of how persistent some of the challenges that we face today are.
Yeah.
And these sort of quasi-fascist currents, they're not new, um, regardless of how shocking the day-to-day news can seem. And, it's sort of both reassuring and depressing to
Yeah.
read that. Let's hope for the reassuring and hopeful part. But I was struck by how you show how these kind of quasi-fascist currents make themselves known in the form of like fear and anxiety and paranoia, and in a lot of cases they're tied to race and sexuality, and music becomes this kind of bludgeon, whether it's to like stir up fears of miscegenation, or we're going to make your kids gay, or queer conversion, or all these sorts of things. And you obviously talk about the PMRC and responses to rock and roll at the beginning, rock and roll, etc. Um, and I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about sort of like this give and take between fear and music, because I think you also depict music as responding to those currents, obviously,
Yeah.
responding to like the rule by fear. But yeah, I'm curious if you think a little out loud a little bit more about that.
I think, yeah, the paranoia, I think you don't need to be writing about music or song in order to identify the paranoid strain in American, life. And, I mean, Hofstadter's book about to what extent the American body politic is based on, or certainly has to engage with paranoia on a daily basis, and it had to from day one, I think. And that is, I think, so sometimes the songs will inflame the paranoia when you think of the Cold War, when you think of Sputnik, Sputniks and Mutniks flying through the air. They're so ironic. Are they atomic? Them funny missiles have got me scared. Jesus hits like an atom bomb. All of these Cold War, I'm in a Cold War with you, honey, or tick, 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 the beating of my heart. All of these Cold War inflected songs, I think, do both, um, I think, point to the paranoia, and sometimes they reflect the paranoia, I think, without much of a filter. Other times they're playing with the paranoia. There's a lot of comedy that comes out of Cold War paranoia as well, in comic songs, and I think Tom Lehrer's songs, for instance, about who's next, who's got the bomb, and all of that. It's scary but funny.
Right.
So I think there is a lot of room for movement with these songs. Um, in terms of also actually confronting the paranoia, in other words, have no fear. I think that's a very important aspect too. And again, you can go back to the civil rights movement. With that, this was about strength. This was about gathering strength, building strength, and taking that strength out onto the streets with the power of song behind you, pushing you forward. Um, so it's I think fear, and of course they were afraid. They all said, so many of the marchers said, yeah, this is scary. I don't know if I'm going to get shot today. I don't know if Fannie Lou Hamer saying, I didn't quote her in the book this, but I saw a quote of hers today. I don't know if I think she's speaking somewhere, and she says, I don't know if I'm going to be shot dead in 2 hours from now.
Right.
But that's what so many of those civil rights marchers getting into their good trouble were doing. And the song fortified them. So, in that respect, the song was, I think, if not an antidote to fear, it was certainly a good challenge to fear. Um, and then you have, so many of the right wing songs that do, imply a certain fear of Soviet expansion, or Stalin, or the Chinese and Korea, or the Korean War, so that's all in there as well. I don't know if that answered it, but
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
both.
I'm going to ask just one more question, and we'll go to the Q&A. And I think I'm also thinking about, I mean, as like a fellow Woody Guthrie scholar, I recall when I was writing my book, really trying to think about what makes Woody Guthrie relevant today, and what makes this not kind of like just a nostalgic study. And I think that reflects just a lot of sympathy with what you're doing, what you actually had already done a lot with Woody, and then what you're doing in this project sort of undermine the rigidity of the category of what protest means. And nonetheless, like, there is this kind of genealogy of Woody to Dylan to Springsteen that's still alive, right? And despite charging hideous amounts of money for tickets to his concerts, Bruce is still at least performing in a very Guthrie-like kind of fashion. And obviously the protest song has been kept alive in other places by a lot of hip hop artists. Public Enemy, probably the most canonical one. And then I think most recently the sort of most eminent example of that is, at least with his most recent work, like Bad Bunny, right? And so I just wanted to ask as the final question, sort of like, what do you think? And you sort of maybe have gotten into this a bit, but what is the status of that category of protest song today? I mean, what's good and bad about people's investment in that category as it stands today for you?
That's a tough question. I honestly can't think of anything bad about people's choice of investing in protest. If it does good work for them, then I'm happy to see it. I mean, I'm not interested in the aesthetics of protest music. You know, a lot of people will say, "Oh, protest songs suck," because they're so ephemeral and they're so hectoring and and they're so finger pointing and all of that. Well, I think there's a place for that, and I guess it depends on your own personal store of tolerance as to how much of that you can listen to before you want to listen to something instrumental, you know, give up and turn on the classical station or something like that. But I think yeah, there is a play that. I mean, in this volume, I think I am somewhat doubling back on backing away somewhat from my resistance to the protest
Mm.
song, which was pretty clear in the first volume, where I said, where I said, you know, I think this is about more than protest, whatever. In this volume, I think I'm pushed into a corner of bringing out the importance of protest music because of the moment that we're in. You know, you got to protest somehow, and you got to keep that protest going, and it has to be loud. And I think that's what is. So it's not just a power chord. When Riot Girl were out there, Kathleen Hanna and all those folks were out there, and Fanny, all those bands were out there in the 70s thrashing their guitars. It wasn't so much about the aesthetics of it, it is about what they were up against. So this it even comes to me right now that it seems to me that my choice of material all throughout, from the conquest, Spanish conquest, to yesterday, is about people being up against something, you
Hmm.
know um and in a moment like the moment we're in now, I don't mind people calling it protest music. I really don't. you know so I don't know if
Thank
that
you.
answered
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Hopefully we have some questions.
Okay.
Carl, you're
Are they going to come up on
Hi.
the
Yeah, no, I'll ask people to unmute and ask their questions directly
okay.
on the call. And if people don't want to do that themselves, I can read their questions for them. So the first one we have is from Larry. Larry, are you able to unmute and ask?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. I really look forward to reading your book. I just wonder if I know you have a really wide scope already, but I just wondered if you touched on anything Asian American in the
Yes.
songs that you looked at.
Very much. I mean, in the first volume, I give a lot of attention to Chinese opera as a means of building a community, working against the insane racism that gave birth to the Chinese Exclusion Act, things like that. I talk about the writings that were left on the walls of Angel Island, which were song lyrics, and so I do a lot of that. In the second volume, I talk about, well, certainly about um, the anti-Japanese songs in the wake of Pearl Harbor, and getting into the whole Yellow Peril thing. So that's not so much Asian music as music about Asians, if you want to call them that. And then also when we get to rap, I spend some time on MC Jin, the Chinese rapper, Chinese American rapper, who's came out with a wonderful rap called "You're Gonna Learn Chinese." So yeah, I think they're a very important constituency of the folks. I'm trying to bring marginalized voices out into the center, and so yeah, there's quite a lot of attention to um, Chinese and Japanese, and some thinking of some in the first volume, not so much the music, but about all the Sikhs that were caught up in the Chinese Exclusion Act and those kinds of things. So most of it's in the first volume.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. Franklin, would you like to press on genre?
Yeah, sure. So I have to preface this with I'm asking this from the point of view of someone who has now heard the description of the book but has not read the book, so it may be unfair from that perspective. So that's the caveat. But so on the one hand, we have, the saying I'm not that interested in the aesthetics of protest music, like whether it's good or bad musically or what form it takes. I'm interested in what the social content is, right? On the other hand, and then point two, maybe there's three hands here. We have the question of centering Guthrie, and that you've maybe been pressed at certain points on, like, am I making him too central because that's your guy, or whatever the reasons for that is. But the irony for me in this is that some of the reason to me that there's a narrow notion of what gets to count as protest music, and that what people picture is immediately folk singer, right? Is precisely a function of Guthrie's centrality, and partly him, partly the way that he was taken up by Alan Lomax and others, partly the way that that tradition was carried forward as an ideal by Seeger, and I think even before Guthrie, the degree to which the composers collective, Charles Seeger and people like that, kind of very consciously moving over from a sort of Brechton Eisler-esque idea of what political song should be to, oh, let's use the people's music of America, right, as a vehicle, all that. Okay. So is there room? And when I think of these things, I also think of all of the statements in Guthrie's writing and Seeger's writing about how he didn't like fancy chords, and how every singer with a smoother voice than his is soupy smooth, and everything to the more gentle than him is a sellout. And there's so much distaste and misunderstanding of jazz in, I don't know how much Guthrie himself talks about it, but you get it from Seeger. He never really accepted it, I don't feel. And strictures on what's harmonically allowed, what's stylistically allowed. So from that point of view, like, how do you stay with Guthrie as your figure, but substantially, critique or complicate that story?
Okay, first of all, Guthrie has a relatively minor place in the book. This isn't, because I did want to, I was done with Woody, except for the extent that he was, that he was there in certain important political moments, historical moments. Woody put on a pose, I will say, about not being interested in he loved the music of John Cage. I quote him on
yeah, I know the letter, right?
Yeah, so there's that. But getting away from Woody, because really I did want to decenter Woody in all of my scholarship at this point. That's part of it. That's another reason why I did these two books, because I just needed to get off the Woody train. But I do spend a lot of time, I think, talking about bebop and the growth of bebop, and bebop as possibly, what struggles emanated from bebop in terms of instrumentally, what struggles emanated from bebop on vocalists. This gives rise to the birth of vocalese, and Lambert Hendricks and Ross, and what they are trying to do. And then also, is there an overthrow of bebop by free jazz, becoming more of a political, that free jazz, or that Coleman becomes the political torchbearer. Dizzy Gillespie says, "Well, I didn't." I didn't want to go out and play 8 bars of protest. That's not what bebop was about. However, there were political reactions to bebop. There were political reactions to Slim Gaillard and Babs Gonzalez and people like that. I spend a little time on Harry Parch about what he is trying to do to expand the iron cage of Western musical composition, not only by coming up with what is it, 43 tone scale, 48 tone scale, whatever it was, of microtones, but also the musical instruments that he invents because he thinks that Western music and Western instruments do not do justice to what music is. So I guess when you read the book, I think you'll see that there is actually a lot more about instrumental music than you might think by picking up a book on song and struggle, I think.
Okay.
Did that answer the?
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, okay, cool. Right.
That was great. I had wanted to follow up on Gus's mention of you talking about instrumental music, so I'm glad we got to that. Catherine had a question that she asked me to read for her, which is that she's curious about your time doing grad studies in Wales and whether that influenced your sense of the relationship between protest or songs of struggle and communal singing.
Not so much communal singing. I would listen because I know Welsh choirs are huge. No, that didn't impact me there, and it really wasn't so much in Wales. But I will say that what got me interested in this, and I think before that, interested in Guthrie seriously, was being an American abroad at a time when it was not a really cool time to be an American abroad. I'm going back to, the first Woody Guthrie book came out in 2012, but my work on Woody Guthrie before that, mostly performed because I used to do these, what I call live documentaries on Woody Guthrie. And they would, and I played them all over the world. I even played it at Glastonbury once. But that was before I got into the serious scholarship. Before that, I was doing these live documentaries on Woody Guthrie, where I would tell his story and play the songs, right? And the reason I wanted to do that, those were starting in the mid '80s to late '80s to early '90s. When you have people like Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush saying commandeering the global bullhorn and presuming to speak for Americans, and I began to look for an alternative American voice that I could broadcast to say to the world, "Hey, man, we're not all like that. Listen to this guy," and it was Woody Guthrie. So that's what got me started on this. So I would say, Catherine, that it's not so much being in Wales, but certainly being an American abroad has really fired up much of what I want to say, because I got my doctorate in American literature from the University of what was then the University of Wales, and it wasn't about celebrating American culture. It was about interrogating it, and American life, interrogating it. And so I think the distance gave me a lot of leeway to get probably deeper into it than I might have if I'd stayed at home. I don't know if that answers it either, but
Yeah, no, that's great. I wanted to ask about that kind of expat condition affecting these projects. So yeah. Lucretia, did you want to ask your favorite protest song questions to Will and Gus?
Basically, it's just what's your favorite? Oh, wait, I'm not on video. It's basically just what are your favorite protest or struggle songs? I happen to love that Bikini Kill song you just mentioned earlier, Rebel Girl. I love it. And then someone else put a comment in the quotes that Dancing in the Streets would be a great one.
yeah.
And I agree. So I'm just wondering more, please Tell me more songs. What do you love?
Well, I see that's a tough question to answer because precisely because there's so much out there, you know. I think my you look at something like Dancing in the Streets, and I do write about that in the book because that became the theme song in spite of Martha and the Vandellas and whatever they intended with the song and whatever Gordy Berry intended with the song. um, that became the soundtrack really to those long hot summers of the Detroit riots of 1960, 1967, and around there, where so Dancing in the Streets, I think the point I'm making is that it's listeners ultimately who will decide what the efficacy of a song is and how it should be used and how it should be interpreted. So that's what I would say about Dancing in the Streets. Um, I am loath to say what are my favorite protest songs because there are so many. I mean, obviously, I would have Woody Guthrie does have a sort of, a special place in my heart, and the people that are that follow on from him. But there's just too much out there for me to take the bait on that one, you know. So I'll try not to. Respectfully, I'll try not to. Wait,
Gus,
Carl,
do you want to
rescue
come under
me.
the spotlight there?
Yeah.
I mean, I will probably demur as well, but I like the question. It's fun. It's a fun, certainly really fun question, and I also just I, the mention of dancing in the street again that just makes me think about dancing and like as the band Reflex, if you lived in the '80s, the politics of dancing,
Not to
etc.
mention the
Disco.
politics of feeling good.
Yeah, right,
Right.
exactly.
Well, yeah, I
Ooh,
mean,
feeling good.
I do spend quite a lot of time. Sorry, Gus, I do spend quite a bit of time on disco in there
Yeah,
and what
that's
that did and what it represented, and not only in terms of what dancing does, but also what and I know you worked on that as well because you had a lot to do with Woody Guthrie and dance and modern dance and yeah, I think that physical thing is very important. And I do touch on it, but probably not as much as I could have if they had given me more room to write, which that's another thing, man. They whacked me for going over. I had to take the garden shears to the original manuscript because we're not going to give you that many words. So that is the answer to anybody who wants to ask, why didn't you include this or include that? Sorry.
yeah.
I'm
And
not
I
allowed.
yeah. No, and then yeah, it definitely is in there. Just I wanted to emphasize the fact that like a good beat, a good groove, like is political in a sense, right?
It matters, yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Great. Elena, that all just kind of poached your question, but maybe you have parts of it that you'd still like to ask.
Yeah, I feel like I was poached. That was basically the question, and I think the discussion of disco also continues it because one of the comments, Tammy's comment, was about. So my question was about songs that are not written as protest songs, but were adopted for any kind of protest, and this is kind of a parallel. Is it a parallel history to yours, or is it included entire like? Did you aim to include it in the book? Because I did see that you mentioned dancing in the street.
Yeah.
But yeah, continue.
Yeah. I mean, I put into the book stuff that I stumbled on. I mean, this is getting back into my love of narrative history. This happened, this happened, this happened. So you will see, I do spend, I hold up my hand and say the majority of this is based on secondary material, secondary sources. So if I'm reading through a history of the Detroit riots and find out what songs they're listening to, like Dancing in the Streets or something like that, well, then I'm going to put it into my book, and I'm going to quote these people and give them their due credit for for allowing me to use their observations and their words. But so that goes back to what Gus's question was as to what songs I chose to put into the book. I chose the songs that I found were reflecting on something outside of the songs. Dancing in the Street, and sometimes those songs, the reflection is not in the lyrics, but the reflection is in the use of those songs. So Dancing in the Streets is a perfect example of that, where Jimi Hendrix's Star Spangled Banner during the anti-WTO Seattle protests. I mean, there's no lyrics there, but it was used, and this Vietnam era challenge was taken up and turned into a no to WTO anti-capitalist. So people, the ingenious ways in which people use songs, I think, even to the perplexity of the people that turned out the songs. I mean, we talk about the PMRC and how one of the Filthy 15 songs that the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, one of the Filthy 15 songs was Twisted Sisters, We're Not Going to Take It, right? And never mind, and I do get into how Dee Snider and Twisted Sister had to defend themselves in front of the Senate for that song, but also how the band themselves were astonished during COVID to find out that song had been lifted and used by the anti-lockdown, anti-mask agitators. We're not going to take it. And they were mortified to see their song being used the same way that so many people are mortified to see how Trump and MAGA are using their songs. Regardless of licensing, how many lawsuits Trump is up against from songwriters, it's, you probably count them on both hands, so people will use the songs and appropriate the songs, however, regardless of what the songwriter's intentions may have been.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Mm.
And we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much, Will and Gus, for this great conversation. Obviously, the topic goes all kinds of places, and I'm looking forward to reading both books. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you for everybody who came and everybody who's attended this whole season of Popular Music Books in Process. We're really grateful to get to do this and to have this community. And I don't know what date we're coming back in the fall yet, but we will be back in the fall as far as I know. So we'll see you all in September. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.